The Renaissance, the rebirth of science and culture. The Renaissance typically refers to a period in European history approximately between 1400 and 1600. Many historians asserted that it started earlier or ended later, depending on the country. The Renaissance is most closely associated with Italy, where it began in the 14th century, when countries such as Germany, England, and France went through many of the same cultural changes and phenomena. The historical development. Contrary to popular belief, classical texts and knowledge never completely vanished from Europe during the Middle Age. Charles Homer Haskin wrote in the Renaissance of the 12th century that there were three main periods that saw surgencies in the art and philosophy of antiquity. The Carolingian Renaissance, which occurred during the reign of Charles Magny, the first emperor of Holy Roman Empire, during the 8th and 9th centuries. The Ottonian Renaissance, which developed during the reign of Emperor Otto I, Otto II, and Otto III, during the 10th and the 12th century Renaissance. The fall of the Byzantine and Roman empires at the hands of the Ottos also played a role. Conflict in Spain between the Moors and Christians also caused many academics to escape to other areas, particularly to Italian city, state of Florence, Padua, and others. This created an atmosphere for revival in learning. The Black Death. The 14th century plague known as the Black Death is thought to have killed up to 60% of the population in part of Europe. The Black Death helped set the stage for Renaissance. Death of many prominent officials caused social and political upheaval in Florence, where the Renaissance is considered to have begun. The Medici family moved to Florence in the wake of the plague. They and many others took advantage of opportunity for greater social mobility, becoming patrons of artists. Was a popular way for such new, powerful families to demonstrate their wealth. Some historians also argue that the Black Death caused people to question the church's emphasis on the afterlife and focus more on the present moment, which is an element of the Renaissance humanist philosophy. Characteristic of the Renaissance. The printing press. The demand for perfect reproduction of texts and the renewed focus on studying them helped trigger one of the biggest discoveries in the whole of human history, printing with movable type. For me, this is the easiest and single greatest development of the Renaissance and allowed modern culture to develop. The printing press was developed in Europe by Johannes Gutenberg in 1440. It allowed Bibles, secular books, printing music, and more to be made in larger amounts and reach more people. Intellectual movement. One of the most significant changes that occurred during the Renaissance was the evolution of Renaissance humanism as a method of thinking. Humanism is described as attempt by man to master nature rather than develop religious. Renaissance humanism looked to classical Greek and Roman texts to change contemporary thought, allowing for a new mindset after the Middle Ages. Thought many Renaissance humanists remain religious. They believe God gave humans opportunity and it was humanity's duty to do the best and most moral thing. Art. Renaissance art was heavily influenced by classical art. Artists turned to Greek and Roman sculpture, painting, and decorative art for inspiration, and also because their techniques matched with Renaissance humanist philosophy. Both classical and Renaissance art focus on human beauty and nature. People, even when in religion works, were depicted living life and showing emotion, perspective, and light as shadow techniques improved, and painting looks more three-dimensional and realistic. Music. Renaissance music was characterized by its humanist traits. Composers read classical treatises on music and aim to create music that would touch listeners emotionally. They began to incorporate lyrics more dramatically into compositions and consider music and poetry to be closely related. Literature. Renaissance literature was characterized by humanism themes and a return to classical ideals and tragedy and comedy. Shakespeare works, especially Hamlet, are a good example of this. Social and economics. The most relevant social change during the Renaissance was the fall of the feudalism and the rise of the capitalism market economy, increased trade and the labor shortage caused by the Black Death, and gave rise to something of a middle class. Workers could demand wages and good living conditions. Writer from this period, Sir Philip Sidney, 1554-1586. He was an English poet, scholar, and soldier who is remembered as one of the most prominent figures of the Elizabethan age. His works include Astrophel and Stella, The Defense of Poesy, also known as The Defense of Poetry and Apology for Poetry, and The Courtesies of Pembroke's Arcadia. Like the best of Elizabethans, Sidney was successful in more than one branch of literature, but none of his literature output was published until after his death. His finest achievement was his connected sequence of 108 love sonnets. Christopher Marlowe, also known as Kit Marlowe, 1564-1593, was an English playwright, poet, and translator of the Elizabethan era. Marlowe is among the most famous of the Elizabethan playwrights and based upon the many imitations of his play, Tamburlaine. They consider him to have been the famous dramatist in London in the year just before his mysterious early death. Marlowe was the first to achieve critical notoriety for his use on black verse, which became the standard for this era. Some of his work: The Queen of Carthage, Tamburlaine Part 1 and Tamburlaine Part 2, The Jew of Malta, Dr. Faustus, Edward II, and the Massacre at Paris. William Shakespeare, 1564-1616, was an English playwright, poet, and actor, widely regarded as the greatest writer in the English language and the world's greatest dramatist. He is often called England's national poet and the Bard of Avon, or simply the Bard. His extant work, including collaborations, consists of some 39 plays, 154 sonnets, 2 long narrative poems, and a few other verses, some of uncertain authorships. His plays have been translated into very major living languages and are performed more often than those of any other playwright. The most famous work of Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, written in 1595. First of the work of Shakespeare's that had become a classical of tragic love, of which numerous tragical, literary, and film versions and adaptations have been made. It is considered its first tragedy. The impossible love between two adolescents, Romeo and Juliet, who have become the model for romantic lovers. It combines destiny and personal choice, a factor that will lead to the terrible end. The Merchant of Venice, written in 1595-1596. In this piece, Shakespeare tries to draw a social backwarness by showing the classes differences between the relationship between them. His view is not classicist, but quite the contrary. He proposed that what is important is not birth, but formation. Sometimes that clashes with the structural and conservative idea of class society. In spite of this differentiation, the ruling classes will not be accepting that they need those they consider inferior, even if they disdain them. Henry V, written in 1597. Another of Shakespeare's most interesting themes, the historical portrait. It contains one of the best-known monologues of all this work, the King's speech before the Battle of Azincourt against the French of St. Crispin's Day. It represents a king very different from the young prince he was. Much Ado About Nothing, 1598. It could be called an experiment, an attempt to mix the two genres he cultivated, comedy and drama. The first act is about comedy, agile, ingenious, and funny, with love that arises almost by surprise, between characters that initially seem opposite. The second act takes on a dark tone, waving betrayals and conspiracy to destroy the initial atmosphere created by the authors. Hamlet, possibly in spite of his extensive and well-known theatrical repertory, this is the most universal of all his work, giving Hamlet's character a priority place in the world literature. It deals with two of these great themes, betrayals and revenge, and the consequence that this betrayal will have not only on the tormented prince, but on all those about around him in an epic and dramatic final. Othello, 1603. Probably the main contribution of this work of jealousy and intrigue, of overflowing passions that lead to crime, is the character of Iago, the incarnation of perfidy and deception. He is the perfect manipulator and he gets everyone to trust him, thus being able to carry out their plans. The strength of the character will move Othello from the center of attention throughout the play. King Lear. Once again, the family as the main axis of the history. The tension between parents and children, the relationship and the shadow they hide. Ambition, another of the central points through which the large number of his work are structured, is showing the daughters of the king who ends up stripped of his power and even of his dignity. Macbeth, 1606. If we speak of ambition, this will undoubtedly be the work that best expresses this drive for power without limits. And in this case, it would not be a man, the main character, but a woman of a great will, Lady Macbeth, who will not hesitate to push her husband to murder to achieve their target. A strong female character at that time when women could not have any connection with theater. Even female roles had to be played by men. Coriolanum, 1608, possibly one of the least known works of Shakespeare by the public, and yet has received good critical acclaims. In it, he places his gaze on one of the environment that aroused his greatest interest, Rome in the period of glory. Unlike Julius Caesar, a more choral piece, here the action centers on Coriolanus in his relation with the multitude, which he despises. Thomas Campion, 1567-1620. English poet, composer, musical and literary theorist, physician, and one of the outstanding songwriters of the British English Lieutenant School at the late 16th and early 17th century. His first published work were 5 songs, which appeared in 1591. Campion's first collection of poems, Tomato Campani Poemata. The book included over 129 epigrams as well as a number of elegies and an incomplete epic poem. The epigram shows Campion's ability to draw a portrait in a few precise lines, and he would rather publish 453 epigrams in Epigrammatum Libri II. Campion had focused his attention almost completely on writing the words and music for songs. Campion would publish 4 more books of Iris, or solo songs, including the third and fourth book of Iris. Edmund Spenser, 1552-1599, English poet who long allegorical poem, The Fiery Queen, in one of the greatest in the English language. It was written in what came to be called the Spenserian stanza. The Fiery Queen can be read on various levels as an allegory of the eternal struggle between good and evil and every form, as a poetic statement of an ethical system, and as a historical allegory portraying the struggle between the pure Protestant tradition of England and the manifold traits of the England Roma's Catholic neighbors. The work itself is a fine example of an attempt synthesis between the tradition of Christianity and those of classical antiquity. How the Renaissance changed the world? The Renaissance was a time of transition from the ancient world to the modern and provided the foundation for the birth of the Age of Enlightenment. The developments in science, art, philosophy, and trade, as well as technological advancements like the printing press, left lasting impressions on society and set the stage for many elements of our modern culture. The Elizabethan era. This period is generally regarded as the greatest in the history of English literature. Historically, we note in this age the tremendous impetus received from the Renaissance, from the Reformation, and from the exploration of the New World. It was marked by a strong national spirit, by patriotism, by religious tolerance, by social content, by intellectual progress, and by unbounded enthusiasm. Though the age produced some of the excellent prose work, it is essentially an age of poetry. And the poetry is remarkable for its variety, its freshness, its youth, and romantic feelings. Characteristic of Elizabethan age: revival of interest in Greek literature. The ardent revival in the study of Greek literature brought a dazzling light into many dark places of the interest. The neoclassical influences were a great benefit. They tempered and polished the earlier rudeness of English literature. Abundance of output. The Elizabethan age was rich in literary production of all kinds. Singing is impossible when one's heart's uncleared, and at any moment one may be laid prostrate. Queen Elizabeth did a better state of things. In Elizabethan age, pamphlets and treatises were freely written. The new Romanticism. The romantic quest is for the remote, the wonderful, and the beautiful. All these desires were abundantly fed during the Elizabethan age, which are the first and the greatest romantic epoch period. Translation in Elizabethan age. The Elizabethan age witnesses translation into English of several important foreign books. Many translations were as popular as the original works. Development of drama. During the Elizabethan age, the drama reached the splendid perfection in the hand of Shakespeare and Benson. Though in the concluding part of the age, particularly in Jacobian age, there was a decline of drama standard. Popularity of poetry. The whole of the age lived in a state of poetic fervor. Songs, lyric, and sonnet were produced in large quantity, and England became nest of the singing birds. In versification, there was a marked improvement. On melody and pictorialism were introduced in poetry by Spenser. Prose and novel. For the first time, prose rose to the position of the first-rate importance. The period produced by some of the world's great playwrights, including Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare. Clothing and fashion. Clothing and fashion play an important role among nobles and the wealthy during this period. There were actually laws that said who could wear what type of clothes. For example, only members of the royal family could wear clothing trimmed with iron fern. The nobles wore very fancy clothes made from silk and velvet. They used bright colors and had large ruffles on their wrists and collars. Jacobean literature. Body of work written during the reign of James I of England, 1603-1625. The successor to Elizabethan literature, Jacobean literature was often dark in mood, questioning the stability of the social order. Some of William Shakespeare's greatest tragedies may date from the beginning of the period. During the Jacobean period, literature was given a lot of importance. It is said that the dramatists and the poets often dealt with issues that affected society. Shakespeare's contribution to literature is immense. He wrote some of his famous tragedies during the Jacobean period. Some of the popular work includes plays like Macbeth, The Tempest, and King Lear during this period. Dramatists, including John Webster, were often worried with the problem of evil. The era comedy included the acid satire of Ben Jonson, the varied works of Francois Beaumont and John Fletcher. Jacobean poetry includes the graceful verse of Johnson and the Cavalier poets, but also the intellectual complexity of the metaphysical poetry of John Donne and others. In prose, writers such as Francis Bacon and Robert Burton show a new touchiness and flexibility of style. The era's monumental prose achievement was the King James Version of the Bible, 1611. A characteristic of Jacobean literature is Shakespeare remained the most important figure in the field of Jacobean literature. However, after his death, Ben Jonson became an eminent dramatist and the best poet produced by the Jacobean period. The role of Ben Jonson is also regarded as significant in literature as he invented the subgenre of the masque. His popular works include plays like Balpone, The Alchemist, Bartholomew, Unfair, and Epicon. The Caroline Age. The Caroline era refers to the period in English and Scots history named for the 24 years reign of Charles I during the 1625 and 1649. The terms come from Carolus, the Latin for Charles. The Carolingians follow the Jacobean era, the reign of Charles' fathers James I and James VI during 1603 and 1625, overlapped with the English Civil War, and was followed by the English Interregnum until the Restoration in 1660. The Caroline area was dominated by growing religious, political, and social discord between the king and his supporters, termed the Royalist Party, and the parliamentarian opposition that evolved in response to particular aspects of Charles' rule. While the Third Year War was reigning in continental Europe, Britain had an uneasy peace, growing more restless as civil conflict between the king and the supporter of parliament worsened. The Commonwealth period. The Commonwealth period, also known as the Puritan Interregnum, is a literary epoch influenced by the English historical context between 1649 and 1660. A fundamental part of this epoch is the Puritan Revolution, which opposed to the influence of the Catholic Church in the country. This period burned after the Second English War, or the Civil War. This caused the execution of Charles I, the last king of England before the Puritan interregnum. After his execution, Parliament and military had a power, and England had a very form of republican government with Puritan ideas. The Puritan views of the majority of Parliament and its support began to be imposed on the rest of the country. Pastimes such as the theater and gambling were also banned. However, some forms of art that were thought to be virtuous, such as opera, were encouraged. Major writers: John Milton, 1608-1674, was an English poet, man of letters, and a civil servant for the Commonwealth of England under Oliver Cromwell. He wrote at a time of religious flux and political upheaval, and is best known for his epic poem Paradise Lost, written on 1667 in blank verse. Thomas Hobbes, 1588-1679, English philosopher, scientist, and historian, best known for his political philosophy, especially as articulated in his masterpiece Leviathan in 1651. Jeremy Taylor, 1613-1667, was a cleric of Church of England who achieved fame as an author during the protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. He is sometimes known as the Shakespeare of divines for his poetic style of expression, and he is frequently cited as one of the greatest prose writers in the English language. Henry Vaughan, 1621-1695, was a wealth metaphysical poet, author, translator, and physician writing in English. He also translated church morals and religious work and two medical works in prose. In the 1650, he began a lifelong practice in medicine. Andrew Marvell, 1621-1678, English poet whose political reputation overshadowed that of his poetry until the 20th century. He is now considered to be one of the best metaphysical poets. The influence of Renaissance and Puritanism died out by the end of this period. Elizabethan Romanticism also came to a close by this time.